At a time when global supply chain disruptions are driving up prices, our government is stepping in. That was Mark Carney this morning in Ottawa, standing inside a grocery store announcing $500 million to protect Canadian food supply chains from Donald Trump's tariff threats. This was not a defensive move, and it was not panic spending. It was a declaration that Canada is building the infrastructure to feed itself regardless of what happens at the American border. For decades, Canada and the US operated as a single integrated food system. Canadian farmers shipped beef and pork south, while American produce moved north. Supply chains crossed the border dozens of times before food ever reached grocery store shelves. The entire system was built on the assumption that trade would remain open, tariffs would stay low, and both countries would benefit from specialization. Then Donald Trump started his tariff war. 25% on Canadian steel, 35% on non-trade agreement goods, threats of 100% tariffs if Canada makes deals with China. Suddenly, the integrated North American food system became a weapon Trump could use for political leverage. Canadian farmers watched export markets collapse. Beef prices dropped 22%. Pork exports fell 8%. Canola shipments to the US declined sharply. Meanwhile, Canadian grocery prices surged 6.2% year over year as supply chains fractured and costs were passed directly to consumers. Trump believed economic pain would force Canada to accept American terms on everything. Instead, he gave Mark Carney the justification to do what Canada should have done decades ago. Build food sovereignty. Invest in domestic supply chains. Create greenhouse capacity for vegetables that currently come from California. Strengthen infrastructure so Canadian food stays in Canada first. Today, we are showing how Trump's tariff threats are backfiring into Canadian food independence. How $500 million is only the beginning of a transformation that makes Canada less dependent on American agriculture. And how protecting grocery prices became the justification Mark Carney needed to restructure the entire Canadian food system. Let's break down exactly what Carney announced and why it terrifies American agricultural exporters. The centerpiece is $500 million from the Strategic Response Fund specifically designated to help food businesses address supply chain disruption costs without passing those costs to consumers. This is not a subsidy program. It is an infrastructure investment designed to make Canadian food production independent from American supply chains. Canadian food companies can now apply for funding to expand processing capacity, upgrade cold storage facilities, build distribution networks, and strengthen supply chain resilience. The goal is eliminating bottlenecks that currently force Canadian producers to ship food to the US for processing, then import it back as finished products. Consider meat processing. Canada produces massive amounts of beef and pork but lacks sufficient domestic processing capacity. Canadian cattle are shipped to American slaughterhouses, processed into cuts, then sold back to Canadian grocery stores at marked up prices. Trump's tariffs made this system economically insane. The $500 million investment aims to build Canadian processing facilities that keep meat production entirely domestic. Then there is the $150 million Food Security Fund targeting small and medium businesses. This money goes specifically toward expanding greenhouses and strengthening local food production. Canada currently imports enormous quantities of fresh vegetables from California and Mexico because domestic greenhouse capacity cannot meet demand. That dependency becomes a strategic vulnerability when Trump threatens tariffs. The new funding allows Canadian greenhouse operators to expand rapidly. Critically, there is a new immediate expensing provision for greenhouse buildings. Any company that acquires a greenhouse operational before 2030 can write off the entire cost immediately. That is a massive tax incentive to build domestic vegetable production capacity right now. Canada has been expanding greenhouse vegetable production aggressively over the past decade. British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec now have substantial operations growing tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and lettuce year-round. The new funding accelerates that expansion exponentially. Within 5 years, Canada could be completely self-sufficient in greenhouse vegetables, eliminating billions in imports from the US. There is also $20 million for food banks through the local Food Infrastructure Fund. This helps community food programs deliver more nutritious food to families in need. At the same time, it creates demand for Canadian-produced food at the community level, strengthening local supply chains and reducing dependence on imported products. Donald Trump did not understand that threatening food security is existential. Countries may accept economic pain in other sectors, but when their ability to feed their population is threatened, governments act decisively. Trump's tariffs hit Canadian farmers hard. Beef cattle prices collapsed 22%. Pork exports fell 8%. Canola shipments declined sharply. The pain was immediate, and political pressure on Mark Carney was intense. A conventional response would have been negotiating with Washington, offering concessions on dairy or lumber to ease agricultural tariffs. Instead, Carney chose a different path. He framed tariffs as proof that dependence on US markets was the problem, not the solution. He announced a major push for Canadian food independence. Farmers were promised support to expand domestic processing, greenhouse production, and national supply chains. This creates permanent structural change. Once Canada builds meat processing plants, greenhouse infrastructure, and distribution networks for domestic consumption, they remain in place even if tariffs disappear. The result is a lasting reduction in reliance on American agriculture. That reality is unsettling US exporters. Canada is a major destination for American produce, processed foods, meat, and grains. If Canada becomes self-sufficient in key categories, those markets do not return. Tariffs are no longer a short-term disruption, they erase future demand. Greenhouse expansion is central to the strategy. Canada's short growing season historically forced winter imports from the US and Mexico, creating vulnerability during trade disputes. Modern greenhouses using LED, lighting, climate control, and hydroponics now allow year-round production. While energy intensive, they are increasingly cost competitive once transportation costs and tariffs are considered. Canada already leads North America in greenhouse vegetable production through Ontario, with strong capacity in British Columbia and Quebec. But the sector has not yet reached national self-sufficiency. The $500 million investment and immediate expensing tax incentives are designed to close that gap quickly. Greenhouses support vegetables, herbs, berries, and other high-value crops, creating jobs while securing food supply. Once built, these operations rely on Canadian energy, Canadian labor, and Canadian water. They are insulated from US trade pressure and represent permanent food sovereignty. This initiative fits into a broader strategy to reduce dependence on the US. Buy Canadian procurement policies, Arctic shipping investments, and expanded trade with Asia all reduce American leverage. Food independence strengthens that position. Politically, the plan is well-timed. Grocery prices are rising faster than inflation, angering voters. By blaming tariffs for supply disruptions and announcing protection against them, Mark Carney made industrial policy broadly popular. The sequence is clear. Donald Trump applies pressure through tariffs. Canada responds by investing in domestic capacity. Within years, Canadian producers serve Canadian markets, and US exporters permanently lose share. The harder the pressure, the faster the shift. Trump expected leverage. Instead, he triggered a transformation that makes Canada permanently less dependent on American agriculture.